Mr. Karim Bitar is an international business lawyer and tax advisor with wide experience in tax planning and restructuring. He's also a lecturer on tax law and public finance at St. Joseph University of Beirut. Mr. Bitar holds a master's degree in business law and taxation, as well as postgraduate diplomas in private law and finances. He represents the Beirut Bar Association at the Parliament for the drafting and adoption of several anti-corruption laws and rules. He will be the chairman for the Fostering Justice and Rules of Law panel of our Lebanon Looking Forward Forum. Mr. Bitar, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I would like to thank first the Lebanese Citizen Foundation, represented by Mr. Karim Bitar, the Royal Norwegian Embassy, and the Institut des Sciences Politiques for their invitation, their excellent organization of this event, and for the honor granted to me to share this first panel, important panel, to discuss and address an important issue at stake, which is the fostered judiciary, fostered justice, and rules of law. When the Germans were bombing London during World War II, Prime Minister Winston Churchill was briefed on casualties and economic collapse. He asked, "Are the courts functioning?" When told that judges were dispensing justice as normal, Churchill replied, "Thank God. If the courts are working, nothing can go wrong." If the same question is posed to us today about Lebanon, what would we say? In point of fact, we can easily respond that everything goes wrong because none of the three institutional powers, legislative, executive, and judiciary, is actually working as it should, and the principle of separation of powers stated in the Constitution is not respected and abided with, owing to several loopholes and gaps in the Constitution itself and in the implementation, as well as in the behavior and interferences of the ruling elite, as it will be explained and expounded successively by the valuable and renowned speaker in their papers and discussions throughout this panel. Those papers will demonstrate that effective governance in Lebanon cannot rely solely on constitutional rules, but rather on consensus among religious communities, and more particularly between political leaders controlling those communities. Those kleptocrats rule the country since decades with total impunity. They control respectively the judicial circuit, the government, and the parliament, and sabotage judicial investigations. Moreover, one should admit that suspicious exchange of personal benefits between the government and the parliament since Taif reforms and Doha consensus distorted the constitutional principle of cooperation between the two powers and the separating lines among them. Sectarian and personal consideration still surmount in practice and in legal status. The prevalence of law and allow the abuse of power by the powerful and the lack of efficient and consistent enforcement of the law. The same conspiracy between the two powers undermines the independence of the judiciary, since the rules that regulate the administration of the judiciary are enacted by the legislator, and the appointment, transfer, and promotion of judges fall within the prerogatives of the executive power, which permits substantial interferences by the said executive in judiciary affairs. It is therefore crucial that the new parliament improve and adopt the draft bill on the independence of justice in compliance with international standards and best practices, and strive as well to allow individuals whose rights and liberties may be breached by adopted laws to have direct access to the Constitutional Court to defend their rights. In addition to the necessary constitutional reforms and effective effort to close gaps, various other measures should be adopted to promote rule of law. in particular by strengthening the relevant state institutions and oversight bodies, enhancing good governance, ensuring transparent and responsible use of public revenues and expenditures, securing clear separation of public position and private interests, to prevent and manage conflict of interest, and finally, improving people's access to information and enabling accountability. The key attributes of good governance include, for its part, in addition to transparency, responsibility, and accountability, participation and responsiveness to the needs of the people, providing them security, equitable access to opportunities, and especially hope for a promising future. It supposes also sustaining a responsive judicial system which dispenses justice on merits in a fair, unbiased, and meaningful manner without any political interference. Fostering justice and rule of law calls, moreover, for collective effort by all parties to catalyze crucial and necessary changes that will help the Lebanese state to meet this target. The importance of civil society in addressing those global challenges should not be neglected as well. With this end in view, it goes without saying that political engagement and political will are needed to reach shared understanding of the challenges and the best ways to resolve them, as well as to embrace real reforms. Excellency, ladies and gentlemen, rules and regulations alone will not guarantee justice and ensure the implementation of reforms to save whatever could still be saved. There must be willing acceptance of the rules and determination to apply them, plus a stronger financial and political accountability with a sanctioned regime and an enforcement process to create a deterrent effect. The scale of these challenges is nothing short of vertiginous. Tackling them head-on to get on track towards meeting the recovery objectives will require robust commitment. This is a national emergency and a problem for all. Thank you.
Thank you,
Sorry,
Mr. Daher.
the panel will be in French, but there is a translation, a direct translation for those who want. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Daher. We know you are all excited to take part of designing updated public policies. So our first topic under fostering of justice and rule of laws is the Constitution and its loopholes by Dr. Wissam Lahham. Dr. Lahham is a holder of a PhD in political science and lecturer at the Faculty of Law and Political Science at St. Joseph University. He's a political scientist focused on constitutional law and political order, publisher of numerous papers related to Lebanese constitutional practices, author of several research studies addressing the role of Islam and constitutionalism, civic values, and political reform. Allow me as well to welcome again Mr. Karim Bitar. Mr. Bitar is a professor of international relations at the USG and École Nationale d'Administration. He is also the director of the USG Institute of Political Science. Dr. Bitar is a senior fellow at IRIS and GCSP, as well as the co-founder and member of the board of directors of Kulluna Irada. He will be discussing Dr. Wissam Lahham's paper titled The Constitution and Its Loopholes. Before leaving the floor to Dr. Lahham, allow me to remind you the ground rules of our sessions. So our session duration is 40 minutes. We'll have 15 minutes allocated to the author, another 15 minutes for the discussant and our chairman, Mr. Daher, in order to discuss the paper. And then we'll leave the last 10 minutes for Q&A for the public present here, as well as all attendees joining us over Zoom platform. Definitely, we encourage your active participation to advocate for policy reforms. In case of time restriction, future group discussions will be coordinated by LCF platforms as announced by Mr. Bifani. The sessions are also streamed via Zoom, and now we are ready to kick off with our first topic. Dr. Lahham, the floor is yours.
As our chairman Karim Bitar said, considering that we are a Francophone university, we have decided to do the first two panels in French. The panel on the Constitution and its loopholes, and the second one with Her Excellency Marie-Claude Najem and Léna Nager. You will have a simultaneous translation. And then in the next, we will continue with panels in English or perhaps in Arabic. I think there's one or two interventions in Arabic. So I cede the floor to my colleague Wissam.
Thank you, Karim. Merci, Karim. I must switch to French. So, merci pour l'invitation. Merci.
Thank you for this invitation. Thank you for the Lebanese Citizen Foundation for the organization of this important event in light of this crucial historical moment in Lebanon. The subjects regarding the constitution are very important in light of the scandal of the election of the speaker of the deputy speaker. 128 deputies were unable to calculate the quorum to elect the speaker. This gives us an idea about the importance of this topic and also regarding the constitution. Allow me at the outset to criticize the title, the constitution and its loopholes. I wrote the text in Arabic and I saw the translation, and I didn't like the title, the constitution using loopholes. And when we speak about loopholes, we think that this is technical, a technical issue, and this is not true, because based on the idea of these loopholes in the constitution, we can think that the problem is purely technical, and this is a strategy used by the political system or regime in Lebanon to let us think that the problem is technical only. And just to speak about the reforms and to say that we need to introduce changes in this or that sector, whereas the problem is a political problem that is related to the political will. It's not only a technical problem. That's why when I say the constitution and its loopholes, we can understand that these are only loopholes, but in all texts, there are loopholes because the law does not apply to all realities and facts. And here I can repeat what Benjamin Constant says, that if you want to extend constitution to all, this means risks for all. So the loopholes or the mistakes are made voluntarily, because these are imposed by political zaim in order to control state institutions and to subject these institutions. In general, we have experts in constitutional law who say that there is a loophole in the Lebanese constitution that says that there is no deadline imposed to the prime minister designate to form the government. One of the solutions is to put in the constitution a text that says that the president of or the prime minister designate should form the government within 1 month, or because in Lebanon we can spend many months to form the government, but this is not a loophole. During the deliberations of Taif agreement, MPs proposed to impose a deadline of 1 month to the prime minister designate to form the government, and one of the deputies who was president, Saif Salam, who was a former prime minister in Lebanon, who objected this decision and said that by imposing this deadline, we are reducing the prerogatives of the prime minister, who will be a game or a muppet between the hands of the president of the republic, who can say or who can reject this Therefore, in case there's no deadline, is not a loophole, it is a decision to reach a solution or an institutional solution of the Lebanese regime. So when we talk about the Taif agreement, we talk about reforms. When I mention reform, I understand this reform for two aims, whether to reinforce the rights and freedoms of citizens or to find mechanisms to find solutions to the conflicts that can be um, present between the different institutions of the state. So the most important is to keep the state institutions. So in Lebanon, if we look at the dispositions of the constitution, in 1990 we see that regarding the reforms, there are two main elements. First, reference to the Human Rights Charter, and the second, which is relevant to something else, whereas all the other issues have nothing to do with the efficiency of the state. We have amended the constitution in 1990 to make the state less efficient and to make any mechanism harder, which requires the interference of a foreign power to play the role of referee between the different political factions in Lebanon to find a solution which is not institutional. So the tradition of decision making and transform the Lebanese institutions into a consensus institution between Zaim is that dates back to 1992 to the Troika system, when the Prime Minister, the President of the Republic, and the Speaker used to agree on anything and used to impose this agreement. And in case of conflict between the members of this Troika, they used to visit Damascus, who was the referee. Actually, the Syrian president was the referee between them. So that's why many Lebanese politicians had their own houses in Damascus. So this reflects the necessity within the Lebanese institutions to have a foreign referee to find a solution to the differences. In 1970, when President Fuad Shahab rejected to be newly a candidate for the President of the Republic, he said in his statement, he said the following, quote, "Our political institutions are way back the modern institutions, and they do not care about the efficiency of state institutions." So in 1970 and 20 years before 1990, he considered that the state in 1970 was not efficient. So with a constitution which was more agile, he considered that the state was not efficient. But so what can we say today after the amendments in 1990 that have paralyzed the political institutions in Lebanon? So there are different elements to speak about this conflict or mechanisms in the Lebanese institutions. I gave all the details in my paper, but let me speak about something which is very important, which are the legislative decrees. There is a tradition in Lebanon that started in 1929, which says that the parliament votes habilitation law. So in 1929, the Lebanese parliament voted for the first time a habilitation law that gives the government the right to legislate by a law decree, and so to interfere in the legislative field to try to reform the state. And since then, Lebanon has always used this procedure of legislative decrees or law decrees. In 1929, this started under Emil Ede and then under Bashar al-Khoury. And at the time we transferred the prerogatives of the High Commissioner to the Lebanese government in order to be able to implement the dispositions of this transfer, and then under Kamil Sham'oun, and the third time under Fuad Shahab in 1959, when he obtained all the rights. And now the many experts refer to these practices. In 1967, this kind of law was used, and this after 1967, after the Israeli-Arab war, and the parliament gave prerogatives for the government. The first, or decree number 1, at the time of President Charles Helwa, it was a capital control law. It didn't allow the Lebanese to withdraw more than 1,000 Lebanese pounds, and this happened on the same day. Today, we're waiting for this law from Mi'ati or from Nabih Berri. After 1990, there's no more law decrees. Why? Because we have Mr. Nabih Berri who says that it is against the constitution. Why it is because the constitution? Because it is against the separation of powers. Of course, it is a judicial pretext. In case there is a problem with this law decree, you have to go for the Constitutional Council, which against the law which gives the right to the Council of Ministers. This is the reality. In case there are such law decrees, the government can take effective and efficient decisions and can be away from the impositions of the political leaders and away from the parliament, which represents the 5 or 6 dimes who are controlling the country. And this way we don't have law decrees since 1990. What we repeat today is a government with special prerogatives, but we confront a rejection essentially by the Speaker of the Parliament, but there's nothing in the Constitution. It is a political practice. Another element which is interesting.
15 minutes, 15 minutes pour parler de la Constitution. J'ai voulu seulement donner quelques éléments.
I wanted only to give some elements.
We'll take 5 more minutes because we are interested to know more about it.
Not a problem. Second élément,
another element or another phenomenon, it is the phenomenon that says that the parliament is the master of itself. How can we translate that? We cannot say that the parliament is sovereign, which is based on the sovereignty of the parliament that goes back to the United Kingdom. In Lebanon, this issue of the parliament, which is the master of itself, this term was launched in 1950s when the parliament used to legislate. It was about the internal laws of the parliament and the daily management of the parliament. At the time, the speaker used to say, for example, yes, we should vote for on this law before that law, but the parliament can decide by itself. This is the real meaning of this term that says that the parliament is free to do so. So the parliament is not free to violate the constitution. The parliament is not free to change the absolute majority. Nabih Berri changed this absolute majority from 65 to 57 votes. This was a particular interpretation. It is against the classic interpretation that under the Third Republic in France. So there's another interpretation of his parliament. We know that when the parliament is convoked in an extraordinary session, it has to respect the agenda of the executive power. But for Nabih Berri, we can vote any law without respecting this agenda because the parliament is the master of itself. A third element which can go in this context, which is a way more dangerous, which is giving the parliament the right to interpret the constitution. This is one of the judicial creations of the regime after Ta'if, which is this is a total aberration. It doesn't respect at all the major principles of Kelsen, which makes the difference between the interpretation of doctrines and the authentic interpretation. According to this version, the deputies can gather with a simple majority and can interpret the constitution, and we are obliged to follow their interpretation. This is wrong. The interpretation of the constitution can only be done by a certain court, for example, like the Constitutional Council, or by using the same method to revise the Constitution or to amend the Constitution, which gives an obligatory explanation, which is an authentic interpretation of the Constitution. Of course, the idea of the Parliament that says that the Parliament can interpret the Constitution derives from the political agreement between the Saims. There are zones or political zones in Lebanon who consider that their agreement is normative. They consider that whenever they agree, we have to agree on what they say. This is, for example, the case of the election of Michel Sleiman in 2008. We know that the Constitution, in its Article 49, does not allow the election of the commander of chief of the army. Then the parliament considered that there was a presidential vacuum, and they considered that he can be elected. Michel Sleiman was elected against the constitution. These are some of the elements. Of course, I tackled in details many other elements. So the important point is not a technical point. Of course, there are loopholes in the constitution, but there is a political will to continue to use these loopholes to create a precarious equilibrium or balance between Zaims who only use the institutions to impose their power and to continue to humiliate the Lebanese and to control the country. That's why I prefer to speak about a about a fact or a fact regime and not about a political regime. So to be in a consensual democracy, we should have a democracy. Lebanon is not anymore a democracy. Before being a constitutional regime, we have to be a democracy. That's why I prefer to talk about an oligarchy that considers that the institution is or should be subjected to its will. So that's why we go to a political logic of Carl Schmitt, who talked about the political constitution, which is the political decision of the political class. It is the consensus between the zaims or the leaders who control the country.
Thank you, Dr. Lahham. We all admit that your paper needs more than 15 minutes, but we need to stick by the rules. So, Mr. Bitar and Mr. Daher, now the floor is yours to discuss the paper of Dr. Lahham.
Merci beaucoup, Wissam, pour cet exposé passionnant, clair, structuré.
Thank you, Wissam, for this very well structured, courageous, and beautiful intervention. Of course, when I have been asked to be part of this panel, I was very happy, and I met Wissam a few years ago, and I shortly noticed that he was really the great researcher and the great intellect of our faculty, because he knows very well the thoughts, political thoughts of the whole Arabic world, and of course he is also well aware of the Western political thoughts, and he is a real expert. He is very honest and courageous. So I've been quite happy to be part of this panel. However, I am a bit reluctant because I'm not a real expert in this topic. However, after talking to Wissam, he convinced me that it's rather a political, structural problem in Lebanon, and it's not only about constitution, but it's also about the political system in Lebanon, with all the loopholes, all the gaps, and the delays, and sometimes the appointment of a prime minister can take several months, and it's done on purpose for sectarian, for personal, for political reasons, as you know. Actually, on the legal level, some or several even MPs are not competent at all. Well, Wissam guessed in advance what was going to happen, and this is why he wrote an article about it in advance. However, that article, despite its importance, was not very well known. And then, all of a sudden, the article was seen and very widely read, and then Wissam wrote another article, and actually many experts found out that Wissam he was absolutely right, and that the problem is strictly connected to the technical aspect of debates and to another deeply structural problem. When I started to learn about or study constitutional law, I, of course, learned about Jean Jekyll, Olivier Duhamel, and other emerging important experts. And there were debates about whether the constitution should be ambiguous or should be express and quite crystal clear. And some experts said that a certain doses of ambiguity would be quite useful and necessary. Well, actually, since we are in a given Lebanese system, which is quite often manipulated by the zaims or the leaders, between brackets, I here recall Obreni, an Israelist writer who wrote a detailed book about Berry, the speaker, and this book really deserves to be translated into Arabic because it is fascinating with all the loopholes. And as you know, since 1992, Berry has become a kind of one-man show. And it's kind of a novel which might not be intelligent economically saying, but well, I do not want to cause problems to the interpreters, but I want to say the following expression in Arabic, which means quite, you know, not very straight and, you know, cheeky and very manipulating person. Actually, actually, he really knew how to manipulate the whole parliament and to his own interests. And well, I recall Bridget who used to say that the parliament should be a dialogue forum, which is not the case anymore because of him, because of the, conservative wing supporting Berry. Of course, there are many ambiguities, and of course, without forgetting the issue of revoking ministers, which must be whether a presidential decision, which was the case before Taif, or it would require the 2/3 of the acceptance or agreement of the parliament. So, looking back throughout the history of Lebanon with the long series of corrupted, incompetent ministries, just two ministers were dismissed. First, Henri Edé, upon the decision of President Frangier, and of course with the agreement and approval of the Prime Minister, and the other one, the other minister, Georges Frem, in 1993. Why? Because he had a project regarding electricity, but which was not in favor of the financial interests of some specific parties. And that was really unfortunate because he was a real ambitious, self-made man. The same applies to another minister that was dismissed before. And actually, Frem, who was dismissed in 1993, had a very good plan which would have saved all, or spared us all the problems we are facing and we have faced. And what was really amazing, between brackets, Hrawi, Hariri, Berry agreed altogether to dismiss Frame and to replace him by Elih Beya. And of course, this cannot be forgotten in the Lebanese conscience. Since 1943, since the independence, only 2 ministers have been dismissed. As Wissam said, should we, for instance, dismiss ministers who are rogue, who do not respect laws, etc., or by a presidential decision, or according to the 2/3 of the vote, positive votes of the MPs? Well, citizens in all cases should have access to much more information, which is the case, I think, today. However, the main problem is not constitutional. It is the fact that the power is withheld by oligarchy, by this political elite. And I forgot to mention that after the first elections, after the withdrawal of the Syrian troops in 2005, I remember the book of Abdullah Naaman, whose title is Lebanon, an Incomplete Nation. I remember the following sentence, which I recall now. I quote: we should get rid of this folkloric democracy, because Lebanon is nowadays not a democracy but an oligarchy, and this is why power is not in the hands of the people but in the hands of 5 or 6 leaders, lords of the war, sectarian leaders, rogue personalities, and unfortunately this has become a kind of tradition, you know. And actually the whole system is the hostage of a small elite, and we have this phenomenon called the elite capture, between brackets. Well, you know, sometimes I have some divergences with Wissam, and of course I really encourage you to read more the writings of Wissam. I think that, as we say, according to the Lebanese saying, the problem is within the fruit, inside the fruit. Actually, why all this distortion? Why? Because this system has been vicious since the beginning, because it is based on you know, identity assignments, and this is why the principles of democracy also acknowledge this. Actually, in his book, Nawaf Salam reminds that the maintaining, the preservation of the sectarian Lebanese model, which is considered by some, between brackets, as a democratic system. And of course I can name other books and other theories, such as Theodore Homsi, etc. However, what Nawaf Salam said, that even for most of the writers and intellectuals, this model could only serve on a transitional and selective basis, and this is why it has been a source of political stagnation. And this is why we wonder whether we should criminalize you know, sectarianism, conventionalism, and especially not to, I mean, or to hold responsible all the zaims, the leaders. After the war, actually, what we have witnessed is the power being in the hands of previous warlords and militia leaders, and this is I mean, actually, they could just change their uniform and wear civil uniforms, and this is how they continued in power. I think that Wissam's analysis is very right, very correct. However, I think that he has some Platonic ideas that are too idealist, while in the practice, I think in a different way, because maybe I have been influenced by my French education. Mr. Bitar, I'm sorry, you are running out of time. Okay, just to conclude, I would like to make a few additions to refuse the Parliament not to continue being a registration place and to end with personal and private interests, to let public interests prevail. And of course, we should continue fighting against this, because this folkloric system has been the most resilient thanks to the financial oligarchy, to some, clergymen, to some religious leaders and other traditional leaders. This is why we should be, find a balance between all different interests. However, this is not the case today, and it's not only due to the constitutional loopholes, but it's due to this sclerotical dysfunctioning and the remaining persistent political interests of sure. Of course, I'm sure Karim would say a lot.
Donc, allow me to extend 5 minutes our session. Since we gave Dr. Lahham 5 minutes for his paper, so Mr. Daher, and then 5 other minutes for the question from the public, either present here or over Zoom.
Je remercie Dr. Lahham et Karim pour leur excellente présentation. Tous les deux, je regarde le chronomètre, je suis un peu comme un joueur qu'on fait rentrer en fin de match.
Well, I feel, thank you, I feel like being a player who's been asked to continue the match, in the middle of the play. Of course, I have many things to say. However, due to the lack of time, allow me to just say a couple of things. And of course, I encourage you to do what Karim said. First, a question, and then another observation. First, well, after listening to you and reading your paper and also reading about the blocking on the level of the executive power, well, and after the sad modifications of the Taif agreement, which were voluntary, and intended blockings, and without a consensus, the 3 presidencies cannot work anymore, and either we had to have the dictatorship in the presidency of the cabinet, or a dictatorship as the speaker of the parliament, or a dictator as a minister who refuses, for instance, to sign a decision. Well, I think that Karim highlighted this. I think that this is a real problematic issue. We should see how to manage this issue, perhaps in a consensual way. To have another vision, to have another kind or way to manage things. And whether the situation, the ongoing situation, and the situation that prevailed during the Ta'if agreements, whether they are the same or there has been some evolution because of the same loopholes, the same gaps, perhaps because of some change among a few citizens, and which really who really aspire to have a civic state. And now the observation, I think that there is collision between the executive power and the legislative power. For instance, regarding budget, Article 86 of the Constitution says that the budget should be adopted before the end of the year. Otherwise, we can extend till the 31st of January, and it can be approved by a decree that is signed by the President of the Republic, provided that the budget is submitted within the deadlines to the Parliament, which means before October, with the 15th. However, we have noticed that in the last 11 years, we did not have this, and no budget has been submitted within the deadlines. This is why the government and the Parliament of today are, the two sides of the same coin. That's all, and thank you. Dr. Lahham, the floor is yours. Thank you. Please use the mic for any question. Otherwise, we cannot translate. Thank you, Karim. Of course, there could be, or actually there are many answers to your question. Just allow me to start with a detailed answer. First, I do not like the expression to promulgate a decree. This is what is used in Lebanon. Actually, this is not very accurate. Well, we should use another term, for instance, to function a decree. And another thing, you have talked about the civic state. And some think that we are in a transitional phases from a confessional state to a civic state. However, I do not agree. Why? First, actually, Lebanon is already a civil state. Of course, acknowledging all confessions and religious denominations, of course, is completely compatible to the civil aspect of the state. And according to the first constitution of 1936, which is based on the supremacy of the state in its relationships with all confessions and based on the principle of political liberalism, and of course that individuals are prior to the society, because every Lebanese can change, is free to change his or her religion. And of course that decision also applied to the Syrians, and actually that Lebanese and Syrians could even not be believers, could not have any religion. And so to announce one's religious belief is something, and to announce the religious identity is something else. And actually, I have recently found out a letter that was sent to President Eddy in 1938 by the French commissioner, and which explains that the belonging to one's convention is as per per his or her registration in the civil status, which means that the religious belonging is not a moral thing, and the state does not want to impose any belief, any conviction. It's just an administrative issue that accepts the freedom of religion, which is guaranteed in the Article 9 of the Constitution, which stipulates that the freedom of conscience, of belief, is completely guaranteed. And so, which means that Lebanon is already a civil state, but we have forgotten this. Why? Because the political dominant class is acting in a way so as to forget about this. And which even is more important, I think that this is actually a political strategy. This is another, political strategy, and this is a technical problem. And now another political strategy, which is even more important. Well, they want us to believe that confessionalism and sectarianism is the real problem. However, this is not the case. It is not true. Of course, there are administrative, political issues, but all this is done on purpose. So, sectarianism as a mechanism, institutional mechanism, is not the issue, because the political sectarianism does not mean to have religious militias and to let Lebanon be governed by rogue people, by rogue politicians, by by war criminals. Political sectarianism and confessionalism does not mean to limit relationships with some countries and to open them with some other countries and to be dominated by these countries. Well, actually, this is what Berry did. Well, actually, our regime keeps repeating every day that confessionalism is the problem. He said last week that he is in favor of a civil state and that he's been asking for it 40 years now. So this is their game. Of course, there are some issues with the confessional theories, but it's not about, representing every religious communities or a community or a religious denomination. But the problem is the way of governing Lebanon and how they transformed the country in. Actually, I do not want to use a negative term because this is my country after all. This is their game. This is their smart game. However, do not forget that Lebanon is already a civil state since the French mandate. But the problem is you, the political class. You have to get out.
Thank you.
Thank you so much. Of course, I also would like to give you a hand because I do agree with you because this political class is criminal and it has been manipulating the system. And these religious sectarian militias have been able to emerge so easily because Lebanon has been influenced by this. Marie-Claude Najm wrote an article, or I think in an interview with Le Figaro, she talked about her wish to have a civil state. However, Pierre Ghanagi, Leah's father, reminded us that Lebanon is originally a civil state. So the difference between us is not technical, but we should know whether the problem was inside since the beginning or there was no problem, but then they caused the problem.
So,
of course, we need to give room to cues and A's from the public. Do you have any questions?
Someone, yes. Mater Nassar.
Maître Nassar, please go ahead. We need a microphone.
Du débat intéressant que nous sommes ici. Docteur Bitar ou M. Bitar, j'aimerais comprendre, est-ce que vous faites un peu abstraction en disant le verre dans le fruit, le verre est dans le fruit, la population est ce qu'elle est. On peut faire une constitution en fonction d'éléments différents. Le micro, c'est moi.
Oui, non, j'ai compris ta question. Adel, c'est également un vieux débat. Adel est également un grand juriste avec lequel j'ai quelques divergences. Donc, je suis de ceux qui pensent qu'une petite dose de volontarisme politique ne fait pas de mal. Parce que si on dit la population est comme ça et ça a toujours été comme ça, on s'enferme dans un système qui ne changera jamais. En France, en 1870, à Adel, 50%, d'après l'historien Théodore Zeldin, 50% de la population française ne parlait même pas le français. Chacun parlait son patois local, des Auvergnats, des Bretons, des Corses, etc. Et il a fallu le travail de la Troisième République, de l'école laïque et obligatoire, pour forger une nation. Eugène Weber, un historien américain, a dit on a transformé from peasants into Frenchmen. On a pris les gens qui étaient chacun dans leur local, dans leur patois, dans leur région, et on en a fait des citoyens français parce qu'il y a eu un volontarisme politique. Autrement, on en serait encore aujourd'hui avec une population française fragmentée. Donc je ne suis pas hostile, je ne suis pas jacobin, mais je ne suis pas hostile à une dose minimale de jacobinisme qui a toujours manqué au Liban et qui aurait pu permettre de renforcer l'intégration, la cohésion nationale.
Docteur Lahham, c'est très intéressant ce qu'on a entendu. Je suis docteur Lina Hacha, docteur en médias, mais la question que j'aime demander, est-ce que vous voyez que tout ce qui passe pendant toutes ces années, et on est dominé, tu as dit, avec des criminels, c'est pas extraordinaire. Accepte et on au Liban.
Oui, puis-je...
Pendant toutes ces années, on accepte.
Puis-je répondre?
Et on applaudit, non?
Ok. Donc,
merci.
Ça, c'est la troisième stratégie de deception.
This is the third strategy of deception. It is saying that this is the mistake of the people. Why saying that? Because the people is the victim. The Lebanese people is the victim of this political class. And who is happy about that? It is the political class. They are happy when hatred increases between the Lebanese, and to say that the Lebanese, so blaming the Lebanese and this allegiance between the Lebanese and the Zaim is based on clientelism. This is because the Zaims have succeeded in the state and to subject the Lebanese who are in need for the money and the services of the Zaim. So when you say the Lebanese defending the Zaims, this is because they are in need for it. So it's saying that we are like customers. So this relation is based on clientelism and not on the constitution. So when the Zaim has no more power. So in 1980s, for example, Kamal Assad had no militia, and so he lost his power, and it was replaced by Nabi Berri. So the Southerners voted for the militia who was in control of the region. That's why there is no free elections in Lebanon who are controlling the different Lebanese regions like the Shui, North, etc. But in Mount Lebanon, Syrians decided to destroy the Christian militias. That's why the Lebanese Christians are no more free. This is because they are out of the control of the militias. This has nothing to do with the genes of the Christians. That's why the Christian Lebanese forces are trying to build again this militia. So this debate between clientelism and constitutionalism is very important. One of the points of view is that this problem of confessionalism and foreign obediences is the problem related to confessionalism or clientelism. These are the two paths of thinking that we should tackle in the next coming days. Thank you very much. It is a very important debate. And now we have Marie-Claude Najm and Anna Nash.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Lahham, Mr. Bitar.